everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. My name is Ash. I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I am super excited to host tonight's discussion and book launch for Vegan Entanglements, Dismantling Racial and Carceral Capitalism. Editor Zane McNeill is joining in conversation with William Horne and Yulia Gilich to discuss their contributions to the collection. But before we start, for folks who are not familiar, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a 14-year-old worker-owned cooperative and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina, on the traditional lands of Cherokee people. We're an anarchist collective that is well known for our curated inventory of titles related to feminism, queerness, social movements, and radical politics. We ship books all across the country, and if you haven't checked us out yet, our catalog is available on our website, which I will drop links to in the chat. Firestorm is also a community event space. Unfortunately, with the ongoing pandemic, we continue to be on hiatus with in-person gatherings, but we have transitioned our community and author events entirely to an online virtual space. So with that said, we do have a list of exciting virtual events coming up, including for Zane McNeill's next edition, edited collection out from PM Press, Y'all Means All, the Emerging Voices Queering Appalachia. That event is happening on Thursday, April 28th. And if you're interested in staying informed about events happening through Firestorm, you can follow us on social media, and I will also drop a link to our community calendar where you can register for events in the chat. A note for those attending in the live audience, there will be time at the end of today's conversation for Q&A. So if you're interested in asking a question at any point, I'll encourage you to submit them throughout the discussion by using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen if you're attending on Zoom, or in the comments if you are following along on the Facebook live stream. Cool. So now moving on to introducing tonight's event and speakers. Examining the intersections of the prison industrial complex, industrial animal agriculture, and capitalism, Vegan Entanglements directly confronts the historical dependence on carceral logics in the animal liberation movement, while offering concrete tactics to activists rooted in the politics of abolition and collective liberation. Zane McNeill is a scholar activist with a BA in history and a master's in political science. He's an experienced organizer who has worked in the spheres of public policy, government relations, and animal law in the nonprofit sector. They are the co-editor of Queer and Trans Voices, Achieving Liberation Through Consistent Anti-Oppression, and are currently working on other projects concerning queer liberation in Appalachia, anti-carceral veganism, choreopolitics, and socially engaged art. William Horne is a postdoctoral fellow at Villanova University and co-founder and editor of the Activist History Review. He researches racial capitalism and its relationship to carcerality in the aftermaths of slavery. His ongoing projects examine the relationship of white backlashes to the state, systems of policing and incarceration, racial science and the eugenic logic of racial capitalism, and Black grassroots activism and revolutionary thought. Yulia Gilich is a media scholar, artist, and community organizer. They are a PhD candidate in the Department of Film and Digital Media at UC Santa Cruz. Their work is primarily concerned with the use of settler colonization in larger imperial projects, particularly those of the United States and Israel. So Zane, William, Yulia, thank you so much for being here tonight, and I will pass it over to Zane.
Thank you, Ash, and thank you, Firestorm. I was telling Ash before this, but I've been going to Firestorm since I was in high school, because I'm from Appalachia and I've wanted to go visit like the quote unquote like most vegan friendly city in the world. And so my mom used to take me to Firestorm when I was like 15 and 16, and I would get my like oat milk coffee. So my name is Zane, and I am, like Ash said, an independent scholar. I've worked on a few edited collections. I was part of Will's activist history review for a few years, which was really fun. And I'm so excited to talk with you all today, thinking through some of the problems in the animal welfare and vegan movements and what an abolition movement can really look like. And so this collection was sort of born out
Did Zane freeze for everyone, or is it just me? Oh no.
I think we may have lost Zane momentarily. We were just getting to the really good part where they were talking about this collection too.
Yeah, it seems like we have lost Zane momentarily. It looks like they have exited the room and will be returning shortly.
You know, we were just talking about the beauty and like benefits of online events. Yeah, but there are definitely also downsides.
Some technical difficulties can be a little awkward. I guess maybe in the meantime, would either of you want to speak to your contribution to the book, maybe like the title and what specifically what the focus of your contribution to the collection is?
Will, do you want to start us off?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. I just want to say too, like, thank y'all for being here, for having me. I have yet to frequent Firestorm books. I'm from New Orleans, and it feels like a schlep, but I hope to make it over there sometime. It seems like really cool stuff going on over there. So my selection for the book is a little bit of a departure for me. The title is The Vampire's Bacon, Meat Work Empire and Abolition. And in some ways, I see that as thinking through the implications of racial and carceral capitalism for today, and thinking through how this sort of history of stolen labor, particularly for this section in food work and in meat work in particular, kind of subsidizes other forms of coercion and other forms of expropriation in our economy and in our society. And of course, as we know from COVID, like, we're all connected, right? So this is both a US issue and a global issue. And so that's something that I've been trying to understand more, I guess. And so in many respects, I think this chapter is sort of my attempt to better understand how these systems work. One of the questions I ask my graduate students is, you know, has capitalism ever existed without slavery? In some ways, I guess this is like kind of my attempt to work through that question. Not fair to ask it, you know, if you're not going to work on it too. So I'm gonna turn it back to Zane. Maybe, is that okay? Okay, cool.
Yeah, sorry, everyone. Imagine I froze. So I don't know where I cut off, but I was introducing myself and introducing the book. So this book really came out of my own experience in the movement, I worked for a ton of different animal welfare organizations, and especially throughout the Me Too AR movement, as well as the summer of 2020, and the organizations were really trying to reckon with the harm that they had done and the structural inequity that existed in these spaces. And so I had done this previous book called Queer and Trans Voices, Achieving Liberation Through Consistent Anti-Oppression. That was really a vegan community project by trans and queer people, and it was really the first of its kind. And there was this great chapter in that by food writer Lee Kurtz on carceral veganism. It was really the first time that I had thought through these ideas, and it really gave language to some of the structural issues and issues I saw both in the discourse these organizations used, as well as when they're going through and trying to push cruelty laws and punitive justice. And so from that chapter, I was thinking through these questions and reached out to Will, and we had worked together in the Activist History Review. And so we were able to bring some of the leading scholars on this to be in dialogue with each other. Lori Gruen, who's a philosopher, Lee, who had done the chapter, and then Justin Marceau, who's an animal lawyer from Stern College in Denver that does work. He did the book Beyond Cages and does work on anti-carceral veganism. And I really enjoyed that conversation. And I wasn't able to participate in it because I was working this group that had these issues that I didn't feel safe to be able to be in dialogue here. And so I kind of watched it from behind, because I was afraid of retaliation in my position, and Will took over. And after that, I was thinking through what continuing this dialogue, especially with the people who I had worked with previously, queer and trans vegans. There's a lot of queer and trans vegans in this book who are thinking through power and thinking through how systems of oppression are interconnected. And for so many of us who do really consistent advocacy, collaborative advocacy, not single issue veganism, we have to think through how all these systems are connected to the prison industrial complex and the immigration complex, and thinking through carcerality. And this is sort of the conversation that I wanted to start. And I was able to bring a lot of different thinkers, a lot of journalists, a lot of activists, a lot of philosophers and activist scholars into conversation with each other to not just think through the problems that we have now in the movement, but also how to move past them and what true anti-carceral veganism and abolitionist veganism can look like. And so it's really a collection of idealism and dream making of what the movement and the world can look like outside of carceral systems, outside of industrial complexes for both humans and non-human animals. And so I think, Will, you would kind of introduce you, who you are and your chapter. I don't know if Yulia, if you wanted to go ahead and do that.
Yeah. Thank you, Zane. Thank you, Will. Thanks, everyone, for being here, and Ash and Firestorm for having us. I'm so excited to be a part of both this collection and this conversation. My first introduction to Zane was through reading Queer and Trans Voices and sort of really admiring the analysis and the attention to precisely the questions of power, the questions of interlocking systems of oppression that have to do with gender, with sexuality, with race, with different kinds of positionalities that, I don't know, some of them really are conducive to thinking about non-human animals and the suffering of non-human animals, and some are really conducive to not thinking beyond non-human animals. And that was kind of my experience with working in Israel and Palestine, and that's the kind of primary bulk of my research has to do with Zionist settler colonization of Palestine and Palestinian liberation work. And I am primarily interested in how Israel not only sustains itself as a settler colonial state, but also kind of presents this facade of a liberal democracy, right? A facade of being a gay haven, and facade of being a vegan capital of the world? And like, how can the reality of settler colonialism and military occupation of an entire people and a nation built on a genocidal ethnic cleansing be talking about like being a democracy and being like very kind and loving to animals? And just the kind of nonsensical nature of like people genuinely praising the Israeli military for being the most vegan army in the world. Like, I just could not like comprehend how it continues to happen. Like, why most vegan army in the world like is a thing that people think is like cool or important. And so I started looking into connections between I guess I would call it animal welfare in Israel and some actually genuinely pioneering pieces of legislation and ways in which animal welfare is elevated socially as an issue, but also how it functions to like hide everything else and like the kinds of violences that are really foundational to the entire nation existing. And so I wrote a chapter that I called, let me look it up, Humane Washing of Israel's Human and Animal Rights Abuses. And so there's this term that's been coined in the past decade to talk about Israeli vegan washing. But in my mind, there's more to that than just the conversation about veganism. And so I'm talking about humane washing as a deliberate tactic of the Israeli state to promote an appearance of being an animal welfare champion for the sake of deflecting attention from the ongoing reality of animal rights abuses, because there's still like, even though there's like plenty vegan pizza in Tel Aviv, it doesn't mean that animals in the country like are not being abused and consumed and exploited, because that's still a reality, but also deflecting from the conversation about Palestinian human rights and decolonial work there. So that's how I came into this collaboration. And yeah, gonna pause here.
Yeah, I think what's so exciting, is when we think through vegan, a lot of people think of it as a diet. And I think food choices as a political decision is really important. But I feel like the way we understood veganism was more of as a politics, right? And as a community, and the way every single author operationalized it was different, because vegan meant something different in the way it was kind of either used as like a weapon, right? They weaponized veganism or greenwashed veganism, or that veganism was really connected to consistent liberation. And I feel like also all of the authors in this book came to this conversation from different places, right? Will's a historian who focuses really on carceral and racial capitalism. I come into this from like mostly like a nonprofit space and animal advocacy space. And there are other people who are writing from philosophy perspectives, who are writing from, their experience with doing direct human rights action, who are doing sanctuary work. And so it's a ton of different people from multiple entry points, from all different kinds of diets, right? Thinking through how power and commodification and exploitation for both humans and non-humans are interconnected, and what we can do to try to fight against those interconnecting oppressions and really limit the violence, both from a structural level, right? And so I'm really interested in hearing both about, your chapters and how you really came into this conversation, and what being part of this conversation has kind of meant for you.
Cool. I guess I'll jump in. I honestly, I feel grateful to be in this space. I tend to think of myself as someone who thinks a lot about work. So actually, like I am really excited to be talking here with Yulia and Zane, because they have, in a variety of ways in their work, like pushed me to think about what it means to work and to work equitably. And so I encountered both of them like way before now. And so honestly, I'm gonna nerd out here for a second, a fan man moment. But yeah, no, I guess the way that I conceive of myself as contributing to this question is in thinking about the way that not only sort of the animal welfare issues play into this, what is essentially eco-fascist system of power, right? Where we base dehumanizing people on our treatment of animals and rhetorics around non-human animals, right? And so I think that's an important part of gleaning work from those people from my chapter. But I think there are other ways to approach that same question that that are equally important. And so that's sort of is my point of entry, I guess, is from more of like a human labor perspective. The other thing that I think really shaped my thinking in this section in its relationship to the other chapters in the collection is this issue of capitalism, particularly racial capitalism, which is a sort of a totalizing force in the US and globally, really, that shapes our lives, our experiences, our choices, like what it means to eat vegan in many places, shapes them in ways that are well beyond our control, at least in an immediate sense. And so part of what I wanted to think through is, if we recognize these systems as unjust, and I think that's relatively low-hanging fruit, the question is what next, right? And so towards the end of my chapter, I point to work around issues of food sovereignty and issues of food justice. And there really is, the potential for some amazing liberatory work to be done here. And that's work that involves all of us, weird, nerdy people, and people who are less weird and less nerdy, right? This is something that we can all contribute to. And so that's something that I found very exciting. And to see a cacophony of voices in this collection who are, all sort of working towards that larger liberatory goal. So I'm gonna be quiet now, but I'm really, as I said, excited to be here and to be a part of this conversation, and really interested to see what these contributions and what these, the sort of larger project helps lead to.
Yeah, I would add that my chapter actually was reshaped multiple times because I feel like it's a really generative question about the connections between animal and human oppression and carceral veganisms. And so I originally was thinking about zoos in Israel and Palestine. And, there's a kind of metaphor and comparison of zoos being like prisons. And then in conversations about the Gaza Strip, there's also a comparison of like Gaza to both a zoo and a prison. And I was trying to think through both like a human settlement that is encircled, a prison and the zoo, and like what are the kind of fundamental connections and disconnects between these sites. And then like through thinking about that, I also found out that there's kind of an interesting divergence in animal rights movement in Israel. So there has been a really robust animal rights organizing on the ground in the 90s, and then through the like first maybe 5 to 6 years of the 2000s. And it was primarily anarchists who also formed Anarchists Against the Wall. And it was the same people who were protesting animal slaughter and Palestinian slaughter. It was the same people who were protesting against the construction of the wall around the West Bank and occupied Palestinian territories and protesting animal cruelty. And that really changed now. Like, there's no conversation like in the movement on the ground about how those oppressions connect. And there's a predominantly the single issue approach to animal rights, to veganism. And I was just really curious, like, how that happened and why, like, what happened to the radical politics from like 2 decades ago. And so, like, kind of juggling all these stories and all these histories, I ended up with the chapter that I did. But I think, like, no matter how I think about it, the liberatory answer that I come up with is that we cannot, like, particularly in the Israeli-Palestinian case, but also broader in any like settler colonial context, we cannot liberate animals without liberating indigenous people, without liberating the land, without decolonizing. And like, I'm not saying it in, you know, in like a lofty, whatever, metaphorical way. No, like, actually, we cannot have animal liberation in a settler colony that operates through capitalist logics and does things for profit. So yeah, I do think that, like, through kind of this engagement and a more deep analysis, I'm hoping that people who are animated by animal rights can get reanimated by human rights as well, and by like other kinds of harm that the state they ostensibly support perpetuates.
I think a lot of the work that had come out previously to this book, that I come from a completely different genealogy, right? That I wasn't aware of till I started researching and thinking through these questions for this collection, really comes from like an ethics of captivity perspective. So trying to spread the vegan message by comparing it to human rights abuses and often not doing a great job, right? And conflating these issues or misusing or misanalyzing, right? Analogizing it. And so I was really interested in coming from a different perspective, right? And really focusing on sort of calling out the vegan movement for it being assimilationist and for it being single issue, and the organizations that have a lot of power and are building campaigns against to actually harm and weaponizing veganism against marginalized communities, right? Hurting slaughterhouse workers, actually going against these marginalized workers through legal cases. And so I think what makes this collection really powerful is that it's coming from both all of these questions from a very interesting perspective, right? Like, I feel like a lot of us are interested in thinking through liberation as a very material goal, and like multi-species justice as a very tangible way to do so. And a lot of these chapters really think through this and think through these huge lofty power structures, right? But then bring it down to something that's really easy and accessible and understandable and digestible. And so I'm interested, you know, we've talked through a lot of some of the larger questions, but I feel like a lot of people aren't even aware of what the term like carceral logics or carceral veganism is, you know, what single issue veganism is. And then a lot of folks are still trying to figure out what human rights has to do for, you know, the animal movement. Like, why should the animal movement be working on something that's outside their goals, and vice versa? You know, why should people who are interested in abolition work think through industrial animal agriculture?
Yeah, those are really great questions. And I think, to Yulia's point, we don't get human liberation without non-human animal liberation. And the reason is because the same sort of expropriative ideas, that is like taking things from people as resources, taking things from non-human animals as resources, right? Treating them as commodities, as Zane put it a moment ago, right? Those are really embedded in this idea that we are going to, to take advantage as much as possible, to treat non-human animals as animals, right? To dehumanize them, and to really treat non-human animals as sort of resources, right? To be exploited, to be mistreated, and whatnot. And I think, when we think about it from that perspective, and of course there's a lot of great writing around this that I've encountered through Zane, really. But I think it's clear that ideologically, that we are treating non-human animals and human animals through this same expropriative framework, where we're taking from them, and treating them only in terms of like a means to an end. And so in that respect, I think our treatments are bound up together.
Yeah, one other thing I wanted to add is I think we have a lot to learn from abolitionist feminists and the ways in which liberal carceral feminism is oftentimes goes directly against liberatory movements and directly strengthens and enlarges the prison industrial complex and by extension the state, right? And I think like we can and we should learn from the conversations around criminalization of domestic violence, right? Because like from 1970s in the US, like there has been this struggle within the feminist movement, like people who call themselves ostensibly the same thing, actually fighting for very different ends. And sort of realizing that immediate fixes that appear to be fixes, right, like criminalization of domestic violence, actually continues to perpetuate that same violence. And how to think about more long-term liberatory solutions that create conditions for, that addresses that harm before it happens, that creates structures and systems that are actually supportive of whatever domestic life is and should be. And if that particular kind of harm occurs, like provides solutions that are not carceral, that are not calling the cops. And I think learning from how abolitionist feminists have dealt with that issue and the kind of like urgency and immediacy of people who suffered from domestic violence and like wanted a very immediate fix to a very real harm. Yeah, I think there's a way we can use both the analytical tools, but also actually unite these movements, because at the end of the day, they're actually fighting towards the same goal. While, yeah, the kind of single issue or carceral or liberal solutions to any kind of harm actually prevents us from ever reaching that goal. So yeah, I don't know. It's kind of a weird tangent, but like maybe we're too easy on the liberals.
I like to ask people when they're thinking through some of these questions, especially in the vegan spaces and these nonprofit spaces, what positive impact has happened for animals from criminalizing, animal cruelty, from criminalizing slaughterhouse workers. And I feel like why organizations have really pushed this carceral vegan rhetoric and punitive justice is for development reasons, right? It's because it's easier to get funding, right, from the kind of violent discourse, because that's what's accepted. And it's not destabilizing anything. It's not troubling power relations. It's really weaponizing veganism against marginalized communities, which, as we see any other social movement, always wins. You can see this in the white suffragettes, you can see this in the LGBT movement. And I would argue that it's a pattern that goes really far back. And when every organization, any movement tries to assimilate and recognizes that white supremacy sort of always trumps everything else, right? As long as you enact anti-Black violence instead of colonialism, you can assimilate into the state. And that's what I understand the vegan movement as doing. And so I know both of you are working on settler colonialism, are working on anti-Black racism, carceral capitalism, racial capitalism. I want to kind of ask you what that has to do, with industrial animal agriculture, what these questions have to do in this book, how you think through it, and what people can do, organizations can do to start to dismantle these really huge and violent structures. So big questions.
Very good questions. Oh, sorry, Yulia, go ahead, please.
Oh, I actually feel like Will started answering that, or like articulating that in a very similar way that I think about it. But as long as we exist in the system that treats the land, water, non-human animals, certain kinds of humans as resources, as expendable, as sources of profit, and as commodities. All of those both beings and systems are always going to be connected. Even if we stop exploiting one particular kind of being, it doesn't solve the actual underlying fundamental issue. And I think analyzing racial capitalism, imperialism, settler colonialism, and fighting the root of all of those evils actually is the only way to make a significant difference in all of those areas. So while on one hand, I think the project of abolition feels and looks and seems not like quite within the reach, or like unimaginable. And I feel like for a lot of folks, it's scary that it feels unimaginable. But I also feel like, I don't know, it's such like a radically different future that we can imagine together, like precisely because we don't have like a recipe for what an abolitionist future is going to look like. There's so much potential in like creative world making. And so I don't know, I really appreciate like the kinds of abolitionist organizations and things that started happening more and more in 2020, and the kind of like conversation about abolition that really was pushed to the fore of the public discourse. And so I feel like entering non-human animals into that conversation is a really important step towards actually achieving abolition and liberation.
%100% concur. I wanted to echo something that Zane said a moment ago about this question that they pose, right? Like, has this worked, this tactic, right? In terms of guaranteeing or ensuring or broadening even a little the rights of non-human animals. I asked exactly the same question in my classes on the abolition of carcerality, right? On the abolition of prisons. And this is a question that Angela Davis famously asks, right? Are prisons obsolete? And one of her primary questions there is like, is this working at all? Like, does this achieve the aims that we claim that these are designed to achieve? We know that this doesn't mitigate crime. It doesn't mitigate harm. It doesn't particularly train anyone to do anything at all. You can get job training, I guess, training in air quotes, for jobs that no longer exist in the US because of offshoring and the global nature of racial capitalism, right? You can do textile work in prison, right? And that you can't get a job doing that, right? In the US, it is not designed to work for the people who are incarcerated and for the communities that they come from. It is designed to work really well for the people running the prisons, for the people who have jobs, right, from the prisons, for lawyers, right, judges, right, I don't know, the people who do the security at the jails and at the courthouses, and the people who work on those cars, right. There's a massive sprawling complex here, and I think there are many points in which that complex overlaps with the one that we are talking about here in the treatment of non-human animals. And particularly in my work, in meat work. And, there's like a literal point of overlap in that meat processing companies often use incarcerated workers or formerly incarcerated workers, both of whom are extremely subject to coercion. They also use migrant workers disproportionately, again, very vulnerable to coercion, right? And so there's issues of wage theft, there's issues of unsafe working conditions, there's issues of speed ups, right? That's a huge problem that's incredibly dangerous, right, in meat work. And all of these are, again, driven along this sort of idea that all of the beings, except for the vampire class, right? All of the beings, except for the elites, are meant to be exploited, are meant to be sort of little, I don't know, pots of blood for them to drink at their leisure. And this is, I want to suggest, not good. And I am hoping that we can become gloriously unprofitable, right? That we can, find ways to work outside of this system, because it is literally destroying the planet. We will not survive if we keep doing this. It is an incredibly bad idea. Right. And so, there are urgencies in terms of justice. There are urgencies in terms of basic survival of species, full stop. And so I think in posing that question, Zane raises an infinity of important questions, which is how can we keep doing this? This is the absolute worst. And we're just all gonna, I'll be quiet. Not good. Very bad, I postulate. Okay.
And I feel like the big elephant in the room that we keep kind of mentioning implicitly is you were saying that criminalization, right, is profitable for this vampire class. The mechanics of the state are that's predicated on white supremacy, right, is profiting off of the criminalization and incarceration of marginalized populations. And so when we're thinking of the interconnections between whiteness and the state and criminalization, right, you can see this with the war on drugs, the systems are working perfectly for what they're supposed to do, right? And so anyone or any systems that are then supporting carceral logics are supporting all of these other systems that are predicated on, the criminalization of Black folks, marginalized people, immigrants, and just everyone who is at the space of just the most vulnerability, right? And that's because being held captive is profitable. And so when we're thinking through sort of this question of capitalism entangled with power and how that's embodied and enacted, I think it's also really worth thinking through what the human is and how the concept of the human has been weaponized against marginalized people, right? And so when people are asking me what animals have to do with human rights, what speciesism has to do with the state and power and carcerality, I think it's really important to interrogate and look at the history of who has been considered as human and what rights were provided to them based upon that. And so I would, when we're thinking through, 2020 keeps showing up, right? Very really, I think Willie had said that it was the 1968 of our lifetimes, right? Really great political mobilization, really visible state repression, right, in a way that people are very mobilized to try to think through these questions, think through mutual aid, think through police power and anti-Black racism. And when I was in these nonprofit spaces, this was the first time a lot of these organizations were even questioning not just what they should do for Black lives, but whether they should do anything at all. And so the idea that was the first time these conversations were happening in a lot of spaces, this shows how ingrained white supremacy is in a lot of these spaces. And also during, the 2020, this was so many people in slaughterhouses, right, were catching COVID. And Tyson managers were literally betting on their lives of how many people would catch it, how many people would die. And I think that just shows how visible, the industrial capitalism sees marginalized and vulnerable people as inhuman, as not worth of moral consideration, in a very similar way to they see their other commodities like non-human animal lives. And so I would just really appreciate hearing you both talk about kind of these questions and how that they went through your chapters and the work that you do.
Cool. Yeah, I was thinking about this earlier, and one of the questions that came to mind for me is, in some ways, what has changed? Like, I feel like so much has changed since I wrote the chapter, and it was like almost yesterday when I wrote it, right? But like President Trump using the Defense Production Act for one reason only, to force meat workers back to the kill line, right? Wow. And yet, like, since that time, in many respects, things have gotten worse for marginalized communities in a lot of scary ways, like very much dependent on the relationship between politics and geography. But when we're talking about meat workers, we're talking about people who live in mostly deeply red states, right? And so they're subject to these sort of mass disenfranchisement laws that we've been seeing, anti-LGBTQ legislation that we've been seeing, right? And so, like, in many ways, we've been seeing wave upon wave upon wave of like anti-CRT, where we can even like speak about the things that happened, right, or are happening. And so I think we're living in sort of a dangerous moment of backlash. That's something that I've written a bit about. But I guess I've wondered what has changed, right? Since we wrote this, because I don't know about y'all, but I wrote this as in sort of a moment where I really had some hope, right? That things could change, that we could mobilize and do things. And I see y'all are laughing, but which is amazing, because like I take that idea actually from your work, and so I'm like, I'm excited. I'm like, we're going to do this mutual aid thing. It's going to be so great. We're going to exist outside of corporative, expropriative logics. And we're going to destroy this system, which is literally killing life on Earth as we know it, right? And that is not only like not borne out, but like in these, especially like meat work communities, the very opposite has happened. They've become more contingent, and I don't know, what do you see that as a question, I guess, is that something that, I don't know, that resonates with you, this idea of like what has changed since do you approach this differently, right, than you did when you wrote this? What do y'all think?
I actually have a note about hope and about change in that regard. So again, going back to 2020, is that when we wrote this? I think
that's when we started having these conversations. Sorry, yeah. And so I feel like it came out of that space when everything became very visible, right? About how a lot of these spaces were so violent and propagating that violence. And I wanted to kind of put everyone in conversation together. But we really started writing between 2020 and 2021. But it's been about a good year, and a lot has changed in a year.
Yeah, but I would say, so what I've noticed in the context of Palestine is that, dispossession keeps happening. Bombings of Gaza keep happening. People get shot on the street. So, right, like the processes and the reproduction of the state through racialized state violence keeps happening. But I think what 2020 changed is actually the conversation about abolition and the conversation about power and conversations about structural racism actually became a lot more legible for a lot of people. And the work that predominantly Black organizers and the BLM movement has done to make this discourse legible, to make people actually from different backgrounds and different contexts understand conditions of structural racism and how power operates and what abolition is sort of earning for, right? And so I think what happened in 2020 really informed the response to what was happening in Palestine in 2021. And honestly, in like all my however many years, this was the first time that I think Palestine has seen so much solidarity on the streets in the US. I think that the conversation about anti-Black racism in the US produced a deeper analysis of the conditions of Palestinians in Palestine. So a lot of folks who we organized with in 2020, who were on the streets then, were on the streets in 2021 for Palestine. And I've never seen that before. And so I really want to, like, again, highlight the kind of interconnected nature of these struggles. And like, once there's a push in one of them, there is a push throughout. So that, you know, and it's not to say that we prevailed and, you know, capitalism no more, but I don't know. I think it is a really hopeful kind of observation that I'm grabbing onto.
So I'm looking through some of the questions we've had in our chat and thank you all for being here and you know, sending us things in. Please do so. We'll have some more time to really dig into those in a little bit. But there's a lot of questions sort of that touch on how we conceptualize justice, right? And I feel like it's very difficult for a lot of people to think through justice, anti-carceral justice, abolitionist justice, right? Since we've been so ingrained in carceral logics our whole life. And so I'm really interested in having you guys kind of discuss how you think through justice, what it kind of means for you, and then also really justice in the law. Like there's this kind of conception or this faith in the law as being a just organization, a just structure, or, you know, even though we have been really challenging very visibly the police state, right, in normal discourse since 2020, there's also this sort of trust, right, that there has to be like an arbiter of justice. So I think it would be really great to think through what an anti-carceral justice looks like, especially connected to our questions we've had tonight.
Should I go? I have a contradictory take. I don't know. I don't know how you're gonna like it. I am not married to the idea of justice. I actually think, especially within the context of law, I don't think it's equitable. I don't think it's liberatory. I don't think it's achievable. And I think it's like a front to actually maintain the ongoing inequalities. For me, the more useful, actually, okay, let me say more as to why. So some of my research has to do with the idea of innocence. And in the settler colonial context, it is, well, one, white innocence, and two, settler innocence. So there is a way in which innocence based on the race trumps any law, trumps any like legalistic justice, right? And we have seen it in cases of police murder of Black children, right? We have seen this in jury acquitting white murderers and white cops. So I don't think that as long as we operate within the systems that rely on race, that rely on property, that rely on the state, I don't think justice is something that is useful and that is going to be liberatory. So yeah, that's my take.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we can achieve justice when we're dealing with systems of profit. These are antithetical to one another, right? And so earlier we were talking about sort of the expropriative, elements, right? That that the people at the top, right, and everyone in between is trying to take advantage, to commodify, both humans and then non-human animals, right, and the environment, the ecology, right, so much so that we are, destroying our planet. I mean, this is not prudent, and I don't know that we get a viable system of survival under a system like that. I also don't know that we can even have something remotely, that we could call justice. And so what does that mean, right? Like, well, we have people whose job is to arrest people. Like, that's their job. That's a problem. And so this requires some massive reimagining. And there's lots of great work on this. Angela Davis is, one of my favorites, but there are many, many thinkers who are doing this work right now. And so there are other ways to approach the issue of justice, apart from profit, apart from commodification. And so these are things that we don't even really pretend to do in the US and in most other places. So we could, if there is a harm in the community, we could fix the harm. That's not how we approach justice right now. We have like what we call a retributive system of justice. We try to hurt the people who hurt people, and that just leaves more hurt people, right? This isn't good. And so there are ways to do this, right? But again, like, we incentivize all of the bad stuff, right? We incentivize arresting more people, bringing more people into courts, having more lawyers, having more judges, right? More prisons, right? And this is, we have almost 2% of our whole population in the US is either like incarcerated in a prison or in a jail, or they're on parole, right? This is a massive amount of people, the very poorest people in our country, who can't have, very few options available to them when they're hauled into court, right? Those are the most vulnerable people, because we've geared the system all around this access to, this proximity to capital. We're not going to have justice like under a system like that. Like, there's other issues too, of course, like the state is sort of premised on the right to wield violence. Can we have justice in that kind of a scenario? I think that's like a really positive thing to think through. And I've had some really great, sometimes heated conversations about that with activists, and I think those are really productive. But I think ground level, in a basic way, we simply cannot have a system that we can call remotely just when it is premised on taking advantage as much as possible of everyone around you. That's really bad.
Maybe I can jump in and to try to address one of the questions that I think maybe connects to Will's point. But there is a question about Israeli army compared to the US army being nicer, right? And like being more gender inclusive, being more inclusive and safer for gay, for gender non-conforming people, and as I mentioned, actually being, I guess, in certain regards, more considerate towards animals, and actually facilitating and allowing vegan soldiers to have vegan meals, to have vegan uniform. But as Palestinians on the ground have been articulating, like for them, it doesn't matter if it's a vegan boot that steps on their neck. And so I don't know how useful this sort of like incremental, slightly better, slightly nicer approach to oppression is. So I don't think it's enough to like reduce a little bit of oppression in one place. But I think that's what kind of vegan washing campaigns have been like mobilized for. That's what they have been like operationalized for, right? To actually present it as a solution. But actually it kind of takes away from even the conversation about the problem. So I don't know, and that's exactly how I feel about the conversation about like the inclusion of trans soldiers in the US Army. Like, I don't care if it's going to be trans soldiers like bombing Iraqi children. I don't care if it's vegan boots stomping on Palestinian ground. I think it's the question of systems of power and systems of oppression that we should be addressing and should be dismantling. So yeah, as long as, you know, there are people whose jobs it is to like break strikes, to arrest people, to shoot if someone goes a place. Yeah, I don't think like vegan pizza is gonna suffice.
And I feel like building on that, whenever a movement is trying to assimilate into power or what's seen as, you know, polite or normalized, it just ends up being white supremacy and capitalism mechanics continuing, right? Just in a different form, in a different way. And we've seen this a lot in vegan washing and vegan capitalism, but also just in tons of different movements, is just that capitalism profits off the own harm it commits and propagates, right? And you can really see that wildly visibly in the Anthropocene, right? Is that capitalism is causing the end of everything as we know, right? And then with greenwashing it, it's still profiting off of that. And that's similar with the vegan movement. And so yeah, there's just no way to work within systems and structures that are already here to be able to dismantle other systems of power, right? Because they're there to create so much bureaucracy or solidify power in a way that it doesn't make sense to try to go through these spaces, which is really funny for me, right? Because I'm starting law school in the fall. And I agree, I don't believe in the law as just at all, right? And even though you can read into statutes and case, you know, to build case law that can grow. Like I was talking to my one friend who had an employment discrimination for being trans, right? And they were able to prove that the West Virginia Human Rights Commission, the West Virginia Human Rights Act, is inclusive of gender and sex discrimination for trans people. And that was the first time that happened. And it's super important for presidents. And it's really great that the law changes with culture, right? But law is there to normalize and systematize the violence that already exists in the state. And so when we think through what change can happen, it's very limited within structures that are already there. And so, you know, what do you both think we should be doing then? You know, are we on a cusp of change? Should we work with mutual aid organizations? How can we start to dismantle these wildly huge structures built on these logics that we've been born into? How do we interrogate that and start to move towards liberation?
That is the biggest of big questions. I would like us to take a moment, have a moment of silence to acknowledge how terrible nonprofits are and how like incredibly colonial They often are, and I don't mean that figuratively. Like I mean that literally, they're about extracting value from, and at the expense of the communities that they purportedly serve. Right? That's not good, right? And the same can be said, as Zane and as Yulia pointed out, right, for the state. And so the question I think that Zane poses is a difficult one. And it's one that I've been wrestling with in terms of thinking about, the possibility of a truly, right-wing, wholly fascist takeover in the US and in other places. We have, in many respects, like globally, this, incredible danger. We've had like really shitty democracy, but it's existed, right? And it's been a tool that people can use. And that, as people use it, right, the people who have designed it say, haha, no, right, we can't allow this. And that's what we're seeing. And so I do think that mutual aid offers the opportunity to work around some of these systems of harm, and to foreground communities, to foreground well-being, to foreground human thriving and survival at the local level. I think that's really exciting. And I think when we, conceptualize that beyond immediate space, so when we start talking about that as being a political movement, as a political project that involves people working together, right? We have the potential for something really exciting. But truly, we simply must have the potential for something really exciting, because I fundamentally believe that it is a survivalist imperative at this point.
Yeah, I think my answer to like what is there to be done, I don't know, is like to organize. I honestly don't see what else is there to do, like truly. And yeah, I think mutual aid is like one of the forms of organizing and forms of community support that we should be building and investing into. I think self-defense and community defense is something we should be doing. We should all know how to reach our neighbors and what they need. So yeah, I think organizing locally and building power on the ground where you are is, I think, the strongest tool we have. Organizing with your coworkers, if you can. I think unionizing is a great thing to do. And I think once we have solid local on the ground organizations, that's how we can organize in solidarity transnationally. That's how we can work across issues, across harms, to try to, I guess, at first mitigate the harms done, but also eliminate the harms that are to come and try to prevent them. And it may look like a total fascist takeover, and it may look like a different virus. It may look like a lot of different things. But I think local organizing is really, really important.
So I think we have time to hit on one more question pretty deeply. And, I've been mentioning it a lot. Will just mentioned it, but it's really the nonprofit space. And we have 2 questions in the chat about this, because a lot of us work in these spaces, and it's really important to try to think through what kind of issues exist there, but also what we can do, especially as staff who've been, face a lot of exploitation in these spaces, to try to move our missions forward. So I'm going to just kind of go through these 2 questions. The first one is on, are we really at this cusp of change in this nonprofit animal rights movement? Because there's been more attention with unionization drives like at ALDF and other organizations, worker exploitation of vegan companies like at Amy's. And a lot of organizations at least have to perform like they're thinking through DEI issues internally and externally, as well as carceral logics, as these kind of questions and critiques are becoming more mainstream. And so the first question is asking if people who are working here, the staff, can they actually make a difference in these nonprofit industrial complexes in these spaces, or what do they do to organize outside of it? And then the other question is just really hits us home is how can these spaces really stop perpetuating, white supremacy, exploitation, colonialism? And is it possible to restructure, reform them? Or really is a completely different model of social justice and care, sort of what I think you both are kind of hitting on, necessary?
Cool. So I work for a university, and I think about this. I see you laughing. I think about this a lot, because it is an extremely predatory system broadly, and that has to do with how not only we finance education for students. In many respects, this is a form of debt peonage. Students will be paying off those loans forever. That doesn't have to be the case, right? We can change that, but that's the system that the people in power have created, and they've made it literally illegal for you to declare bankruptcy and get rid of that debt. There is no way out of it once you're in it. And so that's something I think about a lot. The other thing I think about a lot is my adjunct and contingent, I guess I count as contingent, but coworkers, right? And of course, staff who are, paid and treated very poorly, who are not considered faculty, often subcontracted as well, right? So we have many exploitive structures in our larger university ecosystem. In the US. And I want to emphasize too, like, we have like graduate workers, right, who are paid, $10,000, $12,000 a year in many places, who are teaching classes. We have, people who have earned a PhD who are working, they're teaching a full load, so full-time work, and they're making like $24,000 a year with no benefits, right? And yes, there are people worse off than that, right? But this is an extremely exploitative system, and I don't know, like this is something I struggle with a lot. I think it's important to start these conversations in as many places as we can. I don't believe I can single-handedly destroy post-secondary education. If someone like, has an idea for that, please drop it in the chat and we'll figure it out. But this is a problem, and it is a problem that that unfortunately all of our sort of public good spaces are bound up in. And so that's mine, I guess. I don't know if others want to approach this differently.
Yeah, I also come from a university context, so I'm not particularly familiar or like adept to answer the question about NGOs. But I think if we think about universities and the kind of like, is everything that happens at universities terrible? No. Like I believe in research. I believe in knowledge production. I believe in learning together. I think like a lot of great things happen, but there's also so much exploitation, suffering bound up into it. And so I think, like in my experience organizing within the university, I think it's important to treat it, and maybe NGO like is similar to that, but it's important to treat it as your boss. It's not this lofty thing that is, that cares for you and for the public good and for whatever issue. Like this entity is your boss that is exploitative of you and other human and non-human animals involved in these systems. And so I think when we organize whatever our job is, be it university or NGO or different context, we can also organize against it. I think having conversations about the ways in which, while the sort of values that we have that brought us to this place should be maintained, maybe the institution shouldn't. And you know, as we said, because we don't know what the world after abolition is going to look like, I don't know, I'm pretty comfortable saying I think after abolition we don't need NGOs and universities. So I think it's okay to treat your boss as your boss, no matter what they say, like their values are. And if we end up building enough power to one day destroy them, I am all for it.
So I won't go too far into my thoughts on it because I can talk about it forever. I've personally worked for pretty much all the big names, all the heavy hitters, and I've had almost equally disillusioning and harmful and traumatic experiences at all of them. Prop 12 is just going to, I don't know if you all saw this, but it's going in front of the Supreme Court. I actually was working with an organization on that, was in California, and was put in a position where if we weren't out canvassing 24/7, we weren't seen as doing enough for the animals, which I ended up being sexually assaulted on the campaign trail because I was out in those spaces and facing the kind of violence. This was an organization that I just had a huge amount of people leave because of Me Too AR and had an issue of harassment and hadn't made their space safe enough, very consciously, even after that, and those critiques, and put me in a harmful situation. I've been in spaces where there's been a huge exodus because of employment and sex discrimination, where they were only promoting people who were men and who were anti-labor. You know, I've been in a lot of different spaces. So as excited as I am about the potential for organizing, especially with unionization, and it's very necessary. You know, as we were mentioning before, whenever there's any kind of movement forward and then communal power ends up being a very big backlash. And so I'm very worried for my friends who are working in spaces, but where else are we supposed to go, right? Like I left a nonprofit space, and since then I haven't had health insurance or PTO or benefits, right? And so it's a very difficult question to navigate. I personally am really excited about a lot of this, though. You know, just to plug some of the other work I'm doing, I am the co-manager of an organization called Rights for Animal Rights Advocates that is working through trying to create transparency and accountability in this movement, you know, and actually create a space to provide resources and facilitate conversations, you know, audit and work with management to try to look over their policies and look at the DEI/J issues that exist there. And so there's a lot of cool work that's being done there, but also we can't find funding, right? Because we're a pro-labor group in a nonprofit space. But we're also thinking through, you know, we have a course coming out with Sentient Media, which is one of the only vegan spaces I've been in that has been really great. And so we're doing a course on labor, and animal rights, which is very exciting. And then I'm also in the midst of editing another collection on the intersections between labor, animals, and liberation. And that's also why I want to go to law school, you know, is to figure out what protections exist and how I can work with whistleblowers and organizers and animal advocates who do direct action work to try to use the law in any way possible to try to fight for their rights, even though it is very harmful. I feel like learning how to navigate spaces that are made to exploit you and harm you and gatekeep you is really important. So that's kind of my thing that I'm going through right now. So we just have a few more minutes left, and I'd love if you all had any last thoughts or just wanted to, you know, do a closing statement or something.
I don't really have much to add. I just really want to thank Zane for putting this collection together, for initiating and sort of insisting on these conversations. And I think it's really, really important. And I'm just really grateful to be a part of this. And looking forward to seeing what's more to come. But yeah, thank you, Zane.
Yeah, I want to echo that. It's been a pleasure to be involved in this project in every iteration, including this one. And I think this is such important work, and it's drawing such important connections that we can build on, right? And that we can use to create a livable future, and that's really exciting. I also want to, think back to a point Yulia made a few moments ago, about Black feminist thought. This sort of struck me as we're having these conversations. The Audre Lorde's famous observation about the master's tools, right? That we can't use the master's tools to, dismantle the master's house. And so I think, I am reminded over the course of this conversation that that we're not going to be able to work within the system to overturn it, right? And so, of course, we do that perhaps like to mitigate harm or to educate, right, and to work, in that respect. But liberation requires something more of us, right? It requires organizing, and it requires work, and it requires contact. And an excitement, right, for what we can become together. And I'm, grateful to be a part of a project that does that work. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm very excited. I've worked on this with both of you, and when I was talking about I think like when we first started, I was thinking through the genealogy and what the positionality comes from the work that I try to cite in this collection. We try to cite. It's really coming from the decades and decades and decades of work of Black feminists and vegan Black feminists. And I was on my previous collection with Julia Feliz, I was talking about this yesterday, but they had been saying the same thing, vegans of color have been saying the same thing as we are right now for decades and haven't been given a platform, being really, my whiteness has given me a platform to start have these conversations in a way that other scholars and activists haven't had. And so in the book that I'd done with Sanctuary Published before, they had to do an uphill battle trying to get anyone to cover their books or independent booksellers to hold it. And it was only the first time they had co-edited with a white person, a white academic, that people were actually reaching out to them and they had been reaching out and been ignored for decades. And so the work and the conversations we have here are very topical, but they're certainly not new, and I feel like all of us are really building this on the decades of work done by Black feminists. So I just want to kind of like hold space for that. I think something that everyone can do right now is, you ask your libraries to hold this book. If you're working in nonprofit spaces, tell your criminal justice folks in those departments to read this book, to read the books that are cited here, and to really continually do the work to think through how white supremacy and carceral logics operates in our day-to-day lives, and every day try to be very conscious of that and think through abolitionist futures, right? Because it's not easy. It's not just a one-off conversation. It's hard work and it's difficult and it's disillusioning. And because it's everywhere, right? But it's an everyday process of trying to dismantle and decolonize from these spaces of power. And so, being here is sort of one of the first steps. And I thank you all for doing that. And thank you, Firestorm, for having us.
Yeah, that's well said. Thank you so much, Zane. And thank you, Yulia and Will, for taking the time to join us tonight. This was a really expansive conversation, a really nuanced conversation, and I imagine that viewers in the audience got a lot out of it. And thank you to folks in the audience who came and asked such engaging questions. I think it really added to the conversation that our speakers had tonight. For everyone who registered for this event, we will be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the recording. So you'll have the ability to watch it again. If you enjoyed the conversation, definitely encourage you to pick up the book. It's a great way of supporting the writers and to make sure that this kind of content continues to get produced and shared. So yeah, thanks again, y'all. And for folks who are interested, we're gonna have Zane back next month for a conversation around queer liberation in Appalachia. So definitely want to check that out. Yeah, and thanks so much, y'all. It was great having you tonight. Have a good night. Goodbye now.
Thanks, y'all.